There we are. Cool. So I believe that we've got everything recording here. And can you all still see my screen okay?
Yes.
Awesome. So if you're not able to make one of these in this series, I am going to record them and distribute them to everyone. And basically we're going to have kind of 3 high-level topics that we end up going over. This Lunch and Learn is going to be centered around the cloud. We're going to have a Lunch and Learn that's dedicated really to enterprise GIS and all the different products that you can implement. And then we'll have a third Lunch and Learn that's dedicated to kind of the migration from AWS to Azure and what that looks like. So today we're going to be talking through, obviously, the GIS cloud at IAFF, which exists in AWS.
Lindsay, you went on mute.
Thank you, Shannon. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for letting me know. It's just my wild clicking here, clicking all around the screen. So anyway, today we've got this agenda. The agenda is loosely based on the questions that Shannon had sent over to me that your team was interested in getting answers to. So I'm hopeful that I'll be able to cover all of the different questions that your team had throughout the course of this Lunch and Learn. And these are going to be broken into, again, high-level topics of cloud administration, cloud introduction, administration, and then additional cloud services. So at a very basic level, I am going to talk through just kind of what is the cloud. For anyone on the call who doesn't know this, I know that you all are pretty much cloud experts, but I wanted to just kind of dive into some of the basics in case we have anybody on the call who is new to the cloud. So basically, when we talk about the cloud, a lot of times people have no idea what it is, right? Because we call it the cloud, and so you sort of actually envision it as like a cloud, right? It's just like somewhere up in the sky. You don't really know where it comes from or why it's there or what it does. You just know that, your iPhone syncs to the cloud, right? Or something like that. So once you actually get into administering the cloud, you start understanding more of what it is. And essentially all that we mean when we talk about the cloud is that there are computer servers, actual physical computer servers somewhere that are on someone's property and they're remotely accessible, right? So this could be your organization actually having physical computers on computer servers on premise and having those accessible. That would be kind of your own cloud. And today we're going to be focusing on Amazon's cloud, since that's where a lot of IAFF's GIS infrastructure currently is. And essentially that means that you have computer servers that live on the property of Amazon. I'm sure you guys maybe have seen these pictures of big computer server farms, huge buildings that have all these computer servers in them. There's very complex networking there. And essentially what you do is you rent out the functionality of those computer servers, that live on Amazon's property. At a very basic level, that's what the cloud is. So the next question might be, why would you want to use the cloud? There's a lot of benefits to using the cloud, especially the cloud, as it relates to Amazon's cloud or Microsoft Azure's cloud, right? When you use someone else's cloud like that, you don't have to do any physical administration. So you don't have to have actual computer servers that are on premises. You don't actually have to be like switching out computer drives and things like that. So you have overall less total administration that you have to do. And you also don't have to pay to physically house the computer servers, right? You don't actually have to have real estate on which you're putting computer servers. The days of us having a computer server kind of in like over by the bathroom, that kind of occasionally gets like water and flooding on it. Like that sort of thing doesn't happen anymore, right? If you use Amazon's cloud or Azure's cloud, we don't have to have those in weird spaces in our offices anymore. We also have access to higher end technology. Some of the technology that Amazon and Azure implement is extremely impressive. And for the end user, it comes across as super simple, but the networking and complexity that happens behind the scenes is pretty stunning. Additionally, you don't have to have any dedicated funds sunk into infrastructure. So you don't have to like buy the computer server and have, $10,000 in that computer server, and then be like, oh shoot, I really wish that we had purchased this other model. In Amazon, you just pay essentially for what you use. And when you're done using it, you can stop it and just delete whatever resources it was that you were using. Same thing goes for Azure, Google, all these big cloud providers. It's also a lot easier to stay up to date because either Amazon really kind of automates updates, or those updates, are very easy for you to implement yourself. So just really quick, I just want to go over the infrastructure that IAFF currently has in the AWS cloud, because I think that this will just help frame up this conversation. So essentially, there's the IAFF internal network. That's what you all use on your local machines that connects you to like your shared drives and things like that. And then we have the separate IAFF AWS cloud for GIS. And over here, we have some things called workspaces and FSX. The FSX is a managed file store that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail here in a minute. And the workspaces are virtual machines, virtual desktops up in the cloud that we'll also talk about in a little bit more depth. The biggest thing to know is that these are two discrete networks, right? So if you think about it, IAFF has computer servers on their property somewhere, or perhaps, they're using a cloud provider for your internal network. And then you have the IAFF AWS cloud, different network, different computer servers. Currently, we're bridging those through something called the Amazon Client VPN, which, as you've heard me say, we'll talk about in a little bit more depth here in just a minute. But I just wanted to highlight the couple of products that you currently use in Amazon. So getting into administration, a lot of times I think that it can seem a little bit overwhelming to administer a cloud presence, especially because you think to yourself, like, gosh, I don't know anything about networking or security and whatnot. What I really want to highlight here is that it's extremely simple to access your cloud and to administer it. Now, that's not to say that there's not specialized knowledge needed, but when it comes to just legitimately getting in and viewing your resources, that is very simple. So both Azure and AWS provide you with consoles that you essentially just log into. So, like it's a normal URL, console.amazon.com or whatever the address is. You log into that. You can typically log into that from wherever you want, and then you're able to see your resources. And this is going to be kind of what your homepage looks like when you get in. From here, it's very simple to just click on the resources that you want to look at. And if you remember, I mentioned that you guys are using workspaces. If you're using FSX. So if you wanted to go view those different resources, you would just click on the link and it would take you to those specific resources. Besides having the console access, you also have command line access available. So if you want to do kind of more batch jobs and things like that, if for some reason you want to access the cloud through the command line, that is available. And there are APIs too. There's access through a library called Photo3 for Python, which will get you access to your Amazon environment. You can use that for accessing and manipulating and automating services in your environment. So the other thing to mention here, again, they make the console extremely easy to use. It's the most common way to access and administer your cloud. Again, you have access to many services here. You just click on the one you want. And if you don't see the one that you want here, you can always just go search for the service that you want. So you can put in either a description or the actual name of the service. Some of them have very silly names like Snowflake or Snowball and things like that. But you could search for those different products up here in the search bar. Very easy to access those. You can also click over here in the top left corner where it says services, and you can view all the services that Amazon provides. And if you have, if you're making use of one of those services, if you click into that service, you'll see more details about it. Now, just to highlight this little screenshot from Microsoft, but basically this is what the Azure cloud looks like. Throughout this presentation, I'm just trying to kind of draw some comparisons between Amazon and Azure, since I believe IAFF might be scheduled for this kind of migration over to Azure. And the one thing I want to highlight here is that once you kind of get used to one cloud provider and how they function, they're all pretty similar, right? So you can see a lot of similarities between this console homepage, which you get with Amazon, and this console homepage, which you get with Azure. Again, you have little icons for services. You can go click on more services and get a full list. You can search for your services, and then you have your recently accessed resources. So it looks just a little bit different, but ultimately it's, you get used to one of them. It's pretty easy to use any of them. So now moving on, if we were to actually click into one of our resources, so if I go back a couple slides, you'll see that we have EC2 instances listed right here. If I were to click on that EC2 instance there, I would get this page, which gives me much more detail about that particular service. Now, EC2 instances are the bread and butter of the cloud, right? This is just Amazon's proprietary name for virtual machines. So in Azure, they are called virtual machines. Azure didn't come up with like some, proprietary name for them. but in Amazon, they're called EC2 instances. It's the same thing. They're just virtual machines. So essentially, you're taking that physical computer server and you're essentially providing virtual access to it, renting out parts of that computer server for your use. Virtual machines, this is going to act just like if you were to spin up configure a computer server on premise. That's very much what like a virtual machine is going to do for you. Now you, with your virtual machines, can implement Windows Server, but you can also do Linux and other operating systems. If you do Windows Server and you launch an EC2 instance, it's very similar to your desktop experience on your Windows computer, right? Now, IAFF currently is not using any EC2 instances, but I just want to mention that if you wanted to deploy something in the cloud, some type of technology that you wanted to host and really manage yourself, you would use an EC2 instance, and then you can install programs and applications on that EC2 instance, just like you would on your normal Windows computer. What you do currently use, though, are the workspaces, and that's sort of similar to the EC2 instances, but instead of being a full-blown virtual machine, the workspace is a virtual desktop in the cloud. So essentially what this does is it takes essentially a Windows server environment, so the full-blown virtual machine, and it kind of creates users and it creates a very desktop-like experience for you. So this is going to look so much like logging onto your laptop, right? If you log onto a virtual machine, it's going to be a little bit different because you're going to have like Windows Server options. It's really going to be that remote desktop experience. The virtual desktop really looks a lot like your laptop up in the cloud. It's great for provisioning users access to your environment and really just giving them like a little laptop up in the cloud. And you do make use of these currently in your environment. Another thing to mention would be IAM. So if we go back over to our original, dashboard home, you'll see that we've got IAM listed here. This is also an important service for me to call out because this is your identity and access management. So this is actually how you manage your users in the cloud for cloud-specific purposes. Now, this shouldn't be confused with directory service, which is listed right here. So if you think about it, IAM, that access management, this is for at the high level of the cloud, right? As we get more granular to like what can users do on my specific virtual machines or my virtual desktops, that's where directory service comes into play. And this is Active Directory that lives in the cloud and basically gives you that more granular level of permissions for your individual resources. So that's IAM. We talked about workspaces and EC2 instances. Then you have S3, which is your simple storage service. So this is object level storage. It's very simple and straightforward, and it's also very affordable. You can make S3 very affordable for really large data. And one of the cool things that you can do with S3 is you can also implement lifecycle policies, basically. So you can say, okay, I'm going to put some data into S3. It's going to be there for a couple of weeks. And then once a couple of weeks elapse, then I want to move it to more cold storage, right? That takes longer to access, but it's much cheaper. So that's one of the cool things that you can do with S3. And it's, again, just a very simple, affordable way to store really big data. And Azure has a similar product. They actually, I don't know if they have the little icon here, but they have Azure storage that's very similar to S3. So again, just trying to call back to that, anticipated migration over to Azure, just highlighting that, what's in Amazon is very similar to what's in Azure. And finally, you all also make use of FSX, which is a managed file drive product. So again, throughout this conversation, we're going to be talking about managed products and then kind of self-managed products. If you have a self-managed product, such as some type of software installed on a virtual machine, it's very much like if you were to install that software on your own computer and configure it, or on your own on-premise computer server and configure it. You're going to be responsible for the infrastructure and networking and security of that application. When you use managed products with Amazon, a lot of that management gets taken away and Amazon just kind of takes care of that. So you can launch this FSX, which is a shared managed file drive, and Amazon takes care of a lot of the administration of it. So just keep that delineation in mind as we talk through this of kind of self-managed products versus cloud managed. So it's managed by your cloud provider, whether it's Amazon or Azure. So now I know that one of the things that you all were interested in knowing, and this is a big part of administration in general of any technology infrastructure, backups, right? Like how is everything getting backed up? So cloud providers, especially since you all are actually exclusively making use of managed services. So the workspaces are a Amazon managed version of the EC2 instance. So Amazon manages a lot of the infrastructure and administration here of the workspaces. The FSX is an Amazon managed file store. And then finally, you have an Amazon managed VPN. So you're currently using managed products, which really does save some infrastructure administration, which is great. And it makes certain things really easy. So for example, your Amazon client VPN, this is actually inherently redundant. So it is spread across different availability zones. Now in Amazon, the way that they basically talk about regions and they talk about availability zones. So again, just like remembering that we're talking about actual physical computer servers that live in Amazon's property. Basically, Amazon kind of chunks those into regions. So we have like US East and US West. So that's like the West Coast and the East Coast. And then within those regions, you actually have availability zones. So those are actual different physical locations within that same region. So essentially what that is like if one of Amazon's data centers within the region actually went down. So let's say it was affected by like an electricity outage or something like that. Then your client VPN here would immediately hop over to using the other Amazon, server warehouse and would function there. So this is inherently like backed up if you want to think about it. It's highly available because it's spread across those availability zones. When it comes to the workspaces, what you currently have configured is you're creating snapshots of the workspaces every 12 hours, and that's happening in a managed fashion. So again, Amazon, you set up the policy when you create these managed products, and then Amazon kind of takes care of the rest of it. And finally, with your FSX, you're also getting daily snapshots taken of your drives in FSX, and that's part of the configuration, that you launched initially when you created the FSX drive. So let's say that you wanted to restore a workspace from one of its snapshots or restore the FSX from one of its backups. It is really straightforward. You just navigate into the specific product. So again, I mentioned that, this console home is where you should always return to if you have any questions within Amazon. And let's say that you wanted to restore a backup from one of your FSX drives. You would go into FSX. You would get the specific information for FSX. You'd quickly see the link to the backups. And then you'd right click, go to actions, and it would take you through some prompts to determine what you wanted to do with that, with restoring that backup. So when in question, just return to your console home. Oh, went a little bit too far there. Let's go back up here. So when in doubt, you just go back to your console home, and from the console home, you select the service that you want, and then once you get into that service, there's very easy prompts that you could follow for whatever action it is that you want to take.
Lindsay, I have a question about the backup. So essentially the backup restores, like how does it exactly work? Does it create a new FSX drive, and does that cost us extra money?
Yeah, so let's go take a look at that really quick. So I actually have your console opened up here. So if we went into FSX, again, you just find the service that you want and navigate into it. And like I said, this is all pretty straightforward. On the left-hand side here, you see backups, and you're like, okay, yeah, that's what I'm interested in. I want to think about a backup here. So then we have, like, let's say this backup that just happened, at 5 o'clock UTC today. I check that and go over to actions, and I go to, we can either copy the backup or we can restore it. We went to restore the backup. Let's see here. Because each of these products actually has, sometimes it'll let you overwrite and sometimes it'll just have you like launch a new one. So we'll discover this together. So it actually looks like this is going to launch as a new one. So FSX file system name. So you're actually going to specify a new file system name here. And then you can specify some specifics about it if you want to, such as its networking or deployment type over here. You're going to want to use that same, directory service, that managed Active Directory that I mentioned previously that gives you that more granular permissions for all of your Amazon services. And then finally, you'd hit next, and then you would hit launch. So in this case, it would give you just a brand new file system. But what you could then do is you could mount that file system onto your workspace, your little laptop, desktop up in the cloud. And you could copy the data that you needed over to your existing drive. And then once the drive has, you've copied everything you needed, you could just delete the new drive by checking it, going to actions, and then you can go through and delete the file system. So for the period of time that it is up and running while you're getting the stuff that you needed, that is going to cost you money. But you can very quickly, like I said, grab the stuff you want to copy that over by having both of those the old file system and new one mounted on your machine, copy over the data that you want, and then just come up here in the console to actions and then delete file system.
All right. Yeah. Just one follow-up question to that. Would it be better if we managed our data in smaller drives for, possibly for, if we have to restore any backup files?
Yeah, I mean, there's a variety of reasons why you might want to have smaller drives. Definitely one of them. I mean, you've got, what is that, 4.8 terabytes worth of data right there. So that's a huge amount. First of all, that's a large amount of data from a budgeting perspective, right? The FSX is an extremely, in Amazon, you can think about like your pricing being tied to kind of two things, right? How much management is done by Amazon, and then how quickly is this stuff available, right? So when it comes to FSX, it is very highly managed by Amazon, so you're paying extra money for that. And then in addition to that, your data is extremely available, right? Because it's a file, server that you can mount to your drive and have all of your data and mount to your computer and immediately have that available. So 4.8 terabytes worth of data is maybe a bit excessive to have on one of these drives, both to your point that it is going to take a while to spin this guy back up, but then in addition to that, you're also paying a premium for this. So what I would recommend is probably trying to, as we've talked about, identify older data that you could move over to S3, which is a cheaper way to store data. Now, S3, you're not really going to mount that on your computer as like a network drive. So if you needed to download data from S3, again, it's really simple. We just search for our service that we want here. We go click on it. And if you wanted the data that you were storing in S3, it's pretty simple. You just come in and navigate to your file. You'll right click it and download, right? But it is much cheaper than storing your data in FSX. So I would recommend that you prioritize and look through the data that you have here to see what might be a good candidate to move over to S3. And then also to your point that it will be a lot quicker to spin up these drives if they're smaller, in case you ever do need to do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So then hopping back. Oh yeah.
Sorry, I had a question as well.
No worries.
Is there a way to see like a breakdown by file type of what is taking up that storage?
Yeah, so that is actually going to be, so it's not like an inherent part of FSX. So what you would want to do, you'd have essentially two different options for that. One of the things that I would recommend, you can mount this drive on your computer, and then you can easily use like a Python script to just go through it and just determine like what type of data is in there. That would probably be the easiest, most straightforward way. But then in addition to that, I think you would probably be able to do that with CloudWatch, which we're going to talk about here in just a minute. But CloudWatch essentially monitors your applications and will give you reports on various things about your applications. And that may be functionality that you could take advantage of here with CloudWatch. Probably the simplest way is just to mount it on your computer and just like run a quick Python script, or if you want to do it in PowerShell or however you do that type of automation, you can run through and figure out what files you have there that way.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. All right, so that kind of covers backing up. So then I was going to talk through monitoring. So that was a great question to kind of transition us into monitoring, because I know that one of the things that your team was interested in knowing was kind of that difference between CloudWatch and CloudTrail. For your guys' purposes, you're really only going to be interested in CloudWatch. So that actually looks at your applications and resources and presents reports on those. CloudTrail is really for monitoring activity through things like APIs. So since you guys have so many managed products, you're primarily working with those applications that Amazon provides you. CloudWatch is the appropriate reporting application. If you ever got into like a lot of development through any of Amazon's APIs, then that's where CloudTrail could be a bit more interesting, right? So CloudWatch really provides monitoring that can be set up for doing things like looking at the client VPN. So I know one of the questions that your team had was with this client VPN that is bridging your two different networks, can you view how long people are connected to it and if they're disconnecting from it and that sort of thing? You would set that up actually in CloudWatch. So CloudWatch is a great place to do that type of reporting. It also might be a good place for looking at like your different files in FSX and that sort of thing. An important thing to mention here is, of course, you can always use third-party tools for monitoring. However, since you guys are using so many managed products, you'll probably want to use a managed reporting product from Amazon, which is CloudWatch. Because when you're using those managed products from Amazon, it gets a little harder for third-party tools to really have like direct insight into them. And one other thing to mention here is CloudWatch is great for monitoring that activity, but AWS budget is that those budget tools is actually what you'd want to use for costs, for monitoring costs. So that's just the important thing to note here, is that CloudWatch is really a great product for application monitoring. But if you're interested in budgets, that's really where you'd want to go more to your account, to your billing dashboard. And I don't know if they have an actual link here. Yeah, so AWS budgets is what you'd want to use if you're wanting to monitor your overall spend in the cloud. And there's some really simple tools that you can set up just to tell you, like, my budget threshold for this month is like $50. Tell me if I'm going to exceed that. It'll give you alerts and warnings and that sort of thing. And again, you also have options for analyzing your billing and that sort of thing. So when it comes to CloudWatch and looking at applications themselves, it might look a little bit intimidating, but this is certainly something that I can help you out with, with creating these dashboards. But essentially what you can come through, it looks like Shannon, maybe back in 2019, was creating a dashboard. But we can go through and create dashboards for you that report on a whole bunch of different services. Essentially, this is a great way to build really complex reporting for those managed services that you have in place. So then another thing that I know had been a question was, how did I implement the VPN for you guys? And this is where it kind of linking these services together. So, we have all these different services that are listed in the AWS console here, right? So VPC and EC2 and all this sort of thing. And sometimes what we need to do is we actually have to implement some of those together. And actually, frequently, we have to implement those services together in order to achieve an end product, right? So to create the client VPN, I actually needed to use the AWS directory service, which, remember, I said gives you those granular permissions to what your users are actually doing in specific applications. So I did tie the VPN to your AWS directory service to just get usernames and permissions. And then I also had to do a decent bit within your VPC. So your virtual private cloud is kind of that network container, that box that all of your resources live in. And there's a variety of settings, that are associated with the VPC, such as security groups, like who can access what and when, and then things like availability zones, which I was mentioning. The VPN is inherently redundant because we have it spread across multiple availability zones. So when I implemented the client VPN, it wasn't, just checking a button, which some services are really simple like that. Such as your FSX or your workspaces are pretty straightforward. With the client VPN, there was actually a decent bit of configuration that had to be done across multiple services linked together to create that. So I know another thing that you guys have been interested in were additional services from Amazon, specifically databases, right? So the important thing to note here is you can implement any database you want in the cloud, right? So remember, we talked about these EC2 instances, which is really where you would implement anything that you want. It's a virtual Windows server or any operating system you want, and it can run whatever database you'd like, whether that is a relational database such as Postgres or SQL Server or anything like that, or whether you go down the road of like MongoDB, something like that. You can implement whatever you want on those databases, and they're going to function just like a database would on any virtual machine that was running on premises. You could also implement managed database products. So again, we keep coming back to this idea of these managed products, which Amazon takes care of a significant amount of the administration. So you save some time. It doesn't take as much technical know-how necessarily. And these products, because they're managed by Amazon, they can sometimes provide a more tight integration to other Amazon managed products. This is also true in Azure. So this is not specific to Amazon, this whole concept of managed products. This is across cloud providers. Again, you have your self-managed products where you just spin up a virtual machine and then you just launch whatever it is that you want on that, and then you manage it fully. Or you have the managed product where your cloud provider actually manages that for you, and they take care of those significant aspects of administration. So you have those benefits there of, you have to do less administration, and the products also tightly integrate more with the other products of the cloud provider. But it's also important to remember that sometimes these managed products are not as flexible as self-managed products. This can be especially true when it comes to databases. When you're talking about GIS and you want to have a database that supports your GIS, typically we're talking about a relational database product, right? So a relational database management system, which is going to be like SQL Server or PostgreSQL or Oracle. And those products can be launched in Amazon's RDS, their relational database service. So if you launch a database product through RDS, it's going to be a managed database. So you actually do not have any access or control to the underlying operating system. Amazon takes care of that. They launch and license the database product for you. I think you can bring your own licensing too, but you can also just have them license it for you. And essentially you hit a button and suddenly you have a full-blown relational database that you can access. Typically, though, you're only going to be able to access the database through management tools. You're not going to be able to actually access that underlying operating system, which can bring limitations when it comes to integration, can bring limitations when it comes to automation. So when it comes to thinking about, should I implement a self-managed database just sitting on a regular old virtual machine, or should I do one of these specific managed products from Amazon or Azure? It's just important to kind of have that holistic view of, well, what's my end goal with this, right? Do I really understand the limitations here? So with RDS, for example, if you wanted to move from, let's say AWS to Azure, you can't go directly from, just RDS and, click a button and have it integrate with Azure's managed database. You would have to do backups that are specific to the file type of your relational database management system and then restore those over in Azure. There are certain things that you can't do. So for example, if you want to migrate SQL Server away from RDS, typically with a SQL Server, you can run a quick little script and it'll get you all of your database users and passwords and mapping. That's not necessarily as easy with RDS. So you're going to run into some of those limitations and challenges if you want to migrate cloud providers. If you're using, your self-managed deployment of, say, SQL Server, it's going to function exactly the same on an EC2 instance for the most part as it would on an Azure virtual machine. So just keep that in mind as limitation of managed versus kind of self-managed products. So Amazon provides, in the relational database category, they provide Amazon Aurora and Redshift. Those are specific to Amazon. So those are Amazon created databases that are going to be a little bit harder for you to migrate away from, when it comes to going to Azure. And they're for very specific purposes, such as like big data or data analytics. You also have things like DynamoDB, Amazon Neptune, Lightsail. You can really get into a bunch of these different database products from Amazon. But the biggest thing to remember here is that for the purposes of GIS, you're going to need a relational database product for the most part. And that's either going to be something that you implement on a virtual machine and manage yourself, or it's going to be something that you implement through Amazon's RDS relational database service, and they're going to manage. So as far as additional services, again, I'm highlighting this because I know it's one of the questions that your team had. What types of services are out there for machine learning, and a lot of these products Amazon kind of talks up as being really cool. And I could go into endless detail about all these different products, but the biggest thing to highlight here is that the technology can do basically anything that you want. So the more important thing to do is do some strategic planning and really think to yourself, like, don't limit, what you're thinking about by what you think the technology can do. Think to yourself, what would be the ideal workflow here? What if I didn't have any kind of like preconceived notions about what the limitations of the technology was, what are the different things that we could do and what would the ideal workflow be? And if you could present that workflow, then that's where we can really get into determining what types of products are going to achieve that workflow for you. So if there's like one thing that I could leave you with from this presentation, it's simply highlighting that you can do almost anything you want with the technology. So get really creative with those workflows and really like shoot for the stars. Like, think about, I'm sure that there's things that you think, it's probably not possible. Well, still write them down on paper, write down that workflow. And I bet you there's probably an Amazon product or some type of technology out there that would be able to implement that for you. The other thing, again, we're coming back to this concept of your potential migration over to Azure. So as you implement products, it is actually really important to think, like, is this a product that's going to easily migrate over to Azure, or are we going to have a harder time migrating it because it's something proprietary to AWS? Even once you're kind of settled in a cloud provider, like let's say that you make the migration over to Azure, even once you're settled in that cloud provider's cloud, it might not be the best option to use proprietary products because maybe they meet the need immediately, but then they become, and when I say proprietary products, I really mean managed products from your cloud provider. They might be harder to integrate with those products that you just, manage yourself and that you throw onto a virtual machine. So it's just important to have that kind of knowledge when you're thinking through what you want to do. But certainly the technology can do almost anything that you want. So keep that in mind as you're being creative with your workflows. So I know that was like a lot of information. That was like 40 minutes of me talking nonstop. So I want to open it up for questions here. And, I have your actual cloud up here. So I can show you various functionalities, answer your questions. I just want to make sure that for the purposes of a lunch and learn and covering the questions that you all have, that you don't have any outstanding questions that I didn't answer.
Doesn't look like there's any questions.
Well, hopefully this has been useful to you for the purposes of kind of an introductory lesson on this. So certainly, if you guys want to have a more in-depth session where we really get into like the weeds of exactly how you would go about implementing certain workflows, or we really do some like more in-depth training, just let me know. But hopefully, just going over these kind of high-level topics of, what is the cloud? What does your infrastructure look like? How are you accessing the cloud? How are things getting backed up? How can we go about monitoring it, linking services, and then finally some of those additional services. Hopefully at least gives you enough things to think about so that if you did want some additional training, it provides some direction for you.
Thank you so much. We'll probably be in touch with more questions after this because I'm sure there's a bunch of services people are interested in. As far as, further developing our department's capabilities. Oh, Armand's got a question.
No, sorry, that was by accident.
No worries. Well, yeah, definitely. And when it comes to that strategic planning, I can really help you guys out too to identify, is this service going to be an easy one to migrate over to Azure, or is this going to be difficult? And if it is difficult, then what are other alternatives for you? So can definitely help you out with that. And hopefully it is helpful for your team's strategic planning.
All right, yes, thank you. I'm going to send an email around after this, after we conclude this meeting to get people's ideas so we can start working on enhancing our system.
Cool, that sounds good. And just for like kind of a preview into what next week's lunch and learn is going to look like, if it ends up working out next week, if we need to push it out, no problem. But my intended curriculum for the next lunch and learn is going to be Enterprise GIS. So what ArcGIS Enterprise is, how you can expand your existing GIS technologies. We can especially talk about enterprise geodatabases, so that relational database product that supports your GIS. And then finally, we can definitely talk about cloud and GIS workflows, so how you can integrate your GIS with the cloud to get more out of your products. So, it's sort of like a preview of the movie theater. I'm trying to like get you guys interested in the next one. So
thank you so much. I mean, I'm already interested.
Good. Awesome. Sounds great. Well, thank you all so much. And I'll give you back 20 minutes to hopefully go eat some tasty snacks before you have to get back to work.
All right. Thank you so much, Lindsay.
Cool. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon.
All right. Bye. You too.